Hello everyone, and this is Lala back with another video. And this video has taken me a while to complete because in general I just don't like thinking or talking about the season much, but to think of the gameplay in the season, which was such a huge decline from the first season, was really taxing. Anyways, I'm going to rank the Total Drama 2024 cast by the gameplay exhibited in this season based on the 7 tiers that I always do with these ranking videos. Abysmal, bad, potential, mediocre, solid, good, and great. You can like the video, follow, look at the other videos, and look at any other videos that I will have above during the process of this video. Let's just get right to it. At dead last at 16th place is Millie. I was one of the few people who was higher on her gameplay in the first season, but this season just showed all the flaws of Millie as a player overall. One of them is that she was given a chance to improve as a player and to learn from her mistakes, as Pierre gave her a study book for the new season, and Millie outright refused to read it. This shows that she didn't even care to attempt to improve as a player and isn't willing to learn. Millie was still poor in challenges from the few ones she did in the season, and of course there was her pushing Damien down when she was supposed to do it herself in the second episode. What she did was a really poor social move, as it caused her entire team to hate her, and it didn't even seem like she was in the best place on her team anyways, when she should have been. While she did make up for Damien, she could not save her game at all. She is poor in challenges, poor strategically, poor socially, and actively ruined her game. I thought about moving her up a bit because her team lost as a result of the other team cheating, but I do feel like she did the most actively wrong out of everyone and had the least positives, so here she is. At 15th is Scary Girl, or otherwise known as Lauren. There really was not much to say about Scary Girl as a player for the obvious reason that she's the first boot of the season. Due to that and not having time to do really anything else, she was obviously going to be very low on the list, but she didn't show any sort of potential, and she still did stuff that's wrong. I will say that she's aware of the flaws in her game, especially her poor social game, due to being very weird. Having this awareness is good, and Scary Girl did put in the work to appear as normal, so she could do better in the game. Despite all that work, it was ultimately a failure, as people were still creeped out by her, and all the work she did to get people on her side made them dislike her even more. Ultimately, it caused her to be the first out, and she showed her true colors once again, so it's clear that Total Drama is just not the game for her. And the final person in this tier at 14th is Chase. Ultimately, he played poorly, just like damn near all the early boots in this season. He is ultimately higher than the other two because he at least survived a vote and seemed to be doing decently enough in the first episode. He didn't seem like there was a target on him, and he did fine enough in the first challenge. And even in the beginning of the second episode, it did not seem like he had a target on him, and he was willing to do the challenge. He let Emma's taunting get to him to the point where he wants to film his own stunt for the challenge, ignoring that there are several cameras filming them anyways, meaning that there would be several angles of him doing the challenge. Due to needing the perfect shot, which was just stupid as F, Chase didn't end up actually doing the challenge, which caused him to be voted out. Of course, there was the lack of self-awareness or acknowledgement that he caused his own boot, which is why he ended up low here, since it shows that he is static and doesn't have the ability to learn from the past. At 13th, and the first person in the bad tier is Emma. I was heavily considering putting her in the Abysmal team, or tier, since it was clear from the beginning that there's not much room for her in the season. Just from looking at the dynamics of Team Rat's face, it is clear that she wasn't going to last very long on the season, and it's something that she was aware of herself, as she mentions that she has no alliances. This is odd, since she was very into making allies in the last season, and the fact that she put no effort into it for 3 episodes is really bad. Sure, she helped Chase self-sabotage himself, but that's really the only contribution she made. Overall, Emma was really passive and under the radar, which actually would have worked had her team kept on winning. One of the reasons why I didn't put her in the Abysmal tier is that she's one of the few people who were screwed over since on her final 2 episodes, the other team blatantly cheated, which is the only reason why her team was even in danger, which is why I almost considered moving Millie up a spot or two as well. Had those cheating events not happened, she makes it further in the season, and what makes it worse is that Chris was aware that the other team was cheating. Despite that, she's pretty much set up to fail on her team, where she was used to get to the answers correctly by them going with the opposite of her answers, and when that failed, they kind of scapegoated her. Unlike Millie, she didn't self-destruct, which is why they are in different tiers, despite both of them getting screwed over with the cheating. The final person in this tier at 12th is Z. I'm actually very shocked that he is this low on the list because I do think he has a lot of transferable skills, and there were people that were lower than him, which I ended up bumping up, causing him to go lower. Entering the season, Z was more focused on him being a soda can influencer, so he was never really that focused on the game in comparison. I don't recall him doing well in the challenges, with the exception of the 3rd episode, and even then he was beat by Nichelle. He was the one who told Emma what the team was doing in the 4th episode, which caused them to lose that challenge, and he didn't really contribute much at all. In the 5th episode, he was really bad in the challenge and was just a mess, where it was pretty much portrayed in the edit that either he or Priya were going home, and I think it would have been him getting voted out, due to Priya having more connections, but he was spared because Nichelle quit. With Z not having many connections compared to his first season, and him not being as much of a strong competitor, it did bump him down in my opinion. But he's always someone who's going to make it a decent amount in a season, despite him probably going home in the 5th episode without Nichelle, like I mentioned earlier, because he's a very agreeable man who isn't going to cause drama, is pretty likable, and is very inoffensive in the grand scheme of things. Ultimately, his downfall is pretty much the same this season as it was last season, though I think he handles it a lot worse here in comparison. There was the Caleb and Priya situation where he is told that Caleb is essentially using Priya for an alliance, and he is very obvious about the fact that he knows a secret, which people want to pull out. It's not even like he leveraged the situation for his benefit, especially on a strategic point of view, but he ends up blabbing after he sees Caleb and Priya kiss. This, despite that, could have worked, with Caleb being the obvious boot, but then he rumbled on and on and on about everyone else, which obviously is a deus ex machina from a writing perspective, but anyways, this made people vote him out instead. Essentially, he didn't learn from the mistakes that he had last season and performed worse in every element in this season. The one person that fits into this category at 11th is Nichelle. One thing that I will say about Nichelle that I can't say about a lot of other people is that she actively learned from her mistakes pertaining to her challenge performance and actively put in the work to do better this season. She entered the season, and especially on her team, in a very poor position, with people like Emma stating that it's not even worth interacting with her, which is another flaw of Emma's that I didn't mention in her section. Nichelle wins the first challenge for her team, and that puts her in a better position regarding Team Ratface. She pretty much beasts every challenge that she's a part of, and even if her team does lose, which only happens because of the cheating that was allowed from the other team, she is never a contributing factor as to why they do end up losing. Her downfall comes up because she quits in the 5th episode after her team loses due to the fact that she saw a contract on her bed for the new show, or the supposed new show. Even with this, she wasn't a target by her team, as they were shocked that she quit, and it seemed like either Priya or Z would have went home. With it looking like she would have made it a bit further, at the minimum, had she not quit, we rarely saw her interact with anyone on the season. There are several screenshots of her beside Damien, but nothing conversation-wise of notice came up, and she really came off as isolated from everyone else due to this. It seemed like she was in an agreeable enough position, and she's an agreeable enough person, but it seemed like her performance was a heavy contributor to her position on the team, and we saw nothing about her strategically, which is a shame that she quit before we saw her emerge, and we could see what she would have done. So there's a lot of people in this tier, so bear with me. The first person in this tier at 10th is Axel. I initially had her in the bad tier, and she was a few spots lower on the list as well initially. For someone who's seen as a huge physical threat and has a lot of activity due to being a zombie conspirator, I don't recall Axel ever really dominating in the challenges at any point, though I don't really recall her being a poor competitor at all, so she's kind of middle of the road in that element. That is actually a very good position to be in, to be honest. No one is going to target you for being a poor competitor, and no one is going to target you for being too threatening as a competitor. Her team was on a winning streak in the first two episodes, where they only went downhill due to the other team being allowed to cheat, and despite going to 3 ceremonies, she was never in danger. Unfortunately, I think Axel's huge failing is her social game. I will say that she did improve her anger issues, as she was not randomly snapping at people, and that was a reason why she went home on her first season, but that didn't happen to her whatsoever, so I will give her props on that. Despite all of that, we never really saw her making many friendships or relationships with people on the cast, so while she was a safe person on her team, positionality wise, she was lacking in the relationship department, which did play a part in her downfall. Once Axel got into a romantic relationship with Ripper, her focus on the game completely fell apart, where she would make out with him instead of focusing on the challenge at hand, which we especially saw in her final challenge, and they became the next Bridget and Jeff. This is even worse because in a March situation, you need to be ahead of the game when it comes to the strategy and forming relationships with people, which she was not a part of. She was booted because she was seen as the biggest threat compared to Ripper, and because she didn't have the relationships or strategy. At ninth is her boyfriend, Ripper. I don't have a whole lot to say about him in the season, especially as a game player. He was horrible last season, since he did not get along with most of his team socially, causing him to be in the bottom two every time he was eligible until he was the March boot. Regarding this season, he was not in the bottom two at all during the team portion of the season, which is good and showed that there were some improvement on his end, though I don't think he was aware of these changes. At the same time, he was more active in the game last season, as he did have some allies and tried to game throughout the season, but that wasn't the case whatsoever in this season, as he was just extremely passive. I don't recall him performing strongly in any challenge whatsoever during the season, but I guess he wasn't a liability either. I know Total Drama does not have goats in the sense of a Survivor or a Big Brother show would have, where they are dragged to the end because they're an easy beat, but it seems like he probably would have fit into that purpose, since he was never targeted throughout the season, even when he was eliminated. Ultimately, he became even less motivated once he officially got with Axel, as he spent a lot of his time during the second half of the run this season, making out with her and not even competing in challenges. It got so bad to the point that even when Axel was voted out, Ripper couldn't handle it and decided to quit so he could be with her. I don't recall any other person in a showmance doing this on Total Drama, and that says a lot. So at 8th is Raj. I feel like he had a disappointing season, since he had such promise in the last season. He is picked to be on Boy's team, and pretty much forces Boy to pick Rain, which I would give him props for if he did this for strategic purposes, but it was because he could not be without Wayne. They lost the first few challenges, so he wasn't even a contributor in that element, since he stopped leading and wasn't even performing up to par on challenges, and the last few challenges that his team did win was a result of cheating, which he and Wayne were against anyways. He was really just there in the pre-merge, and while it was great that he had a 3-member alliance lock, so he was pretty safe in the team portion throughout the season, he didn't do anything notable. Boy ended up going home right at the merge, and he was obviously disappointed with this, but Raj just disappeared and fell off the wayside. He needed to be led strategically by Boy, which we saw in the first half of the season, but there was nothing there during the second half of the season, as it seemed like because no one took him and Wayne seriously, everyone left them alone, and they were never active in the strategic element of the season. The one challenge he won post-merge was carried by Julia, as it was the other duos and pairs that were being targeted and the other people that blew up their games more than he did, which is a prime example of Z, which is why he got to the final 5. The passivity and the stupidity that he exhibited definitely benefited him lasting this long, but he never gained power in the season, and I believe he decided the final 5 vote pertaining how he and Wayne would vote was based on flipping a coin. We are never really given a reason as to why Raj was voted out over Wayne, but I think his passivity, while not coming off as painfully dumb in comparison, was why he was the one booted. So he was seen as a bit less dumb than Wayne. There comes a point where you need to be active in the game, and we essentially saw the more active players get together, and they outplayed him here. Whatever potential he had in his first season was essentially gone here, and there really isn't anything inherently impressive about his run here. He did not self-sabotage, which I cannot say for some of the others, and he did last long, which is why he is here, but that's really it. And at 7th is his best friend, Wayne. Honestly, everything I said about Raj could easily be applied to Wayne, as he was also someone who showed some promise as a player last season, despite not being the smartest person, but all that went out the window here. One thing is that he was a leader for a lot of the challenges last season, and we saw him performing well in those challenges, but all of those traits went away in this season. Well, Wade was still performing in challenges, he really wasn't strong in them, as his team lost the first two challenges, and the other challenges they won was a result of cheating, which he was vehemently against, so his contributions didn't even lead them to any wins. He did win one challenge in the merge portion of the season, but it was mainly due to Julia, as he and Raj were too busy fooling around the entire challenge. There was one episode where Wayne didn't even perform in the challenge, since he was stranded for damn near the entire challenge and couldn't find his way back. Boy was leading the trio strategically, and he was very lost after Boy was booted, but the others stated that they left him and Raj alone because they kind of forgot about them, and saw him as a complete non-threat slash non-factor. When it comes to strategy, there was absolutely nothing there, and he came off as a lot dumber this season to a painful level. We really don't have an explanation as to why he was kept safe over Raj, but the others were shocked that he didn't make it to the finale, and there was a consistent mention of him not being a factor. It wasn't until the finale where we are shown that most of the cast liked him, and they pulled the same stunt with Beth in TDA, but she's at least a bit more active in comparison. So props to him for having a good social game, which we didn't know about until now. This did cause him to get most of the helpers, which was and was not an advantage at various points, and he won by luck, but it showed that most of the cast wanted him to win. I don't really have anything else to say about him. And the final person in this tier at 6th is Boeing. For someone who had his back against the wall from the very beginning, and for someone who placed 11th, if I remember correctly, I do think he played decently enough. Everyone not only lived through last season, but watched him as well, so of course they had a negative opinion on him, where they just trust him. Where they distrust him, though they don't have this with Julia, which I found odd. We learned that Raj spoke to him about apologizing before the season, and while he is goaded by his boyfriend to do it, he skews it up. Raj had to be the one to tell him to choose Wayne, which is definitely a good move since it gave him a voting block that kept him safe. We did see him make up with Julia, which is a good move since them not going after one another kept one another safe, though he was forced to work with Julia and MK, my bad, especially with the cheating mess. He was definitely in a hard position on his team with the whole cheating scandal, since they kept on losing, but he kept on lying to his friends about it. But Chris was very aware of the cheating and allowed them to cheat, and even in that case, I don't think he would have gone home anyways. They do have a very early merge, which I do think kind of screwed him, as it put him in a position where there are a lot more numbers of people to go against him. And he was close to winning the final challenge, where I do think he could have made some leeway for the rest of the season had he won that specific challenge. Ultimately, he was screwed over by the perceptions of him before the season, which is also his fault, based on his actions, and Julia led the charge against him. But I do think how Boy maneuvered himself showed that he had some promise, since he wasn't alienating a bunch of people like Alejandro was, who was in the same position on All-Stars, and also knew when to work with your enemy at points during the season. I do think that he was leading the Hockey Bros, and they were clueless without him. He had his back against the wall and still did okay enough for himself. So the first person in this tier at 5th is Damien. It is crazy that Damien is this high on the list, since I'm honestly struggling to find things that he really did of note throughout the season, and honestly, I'm kind of debating moving him to the mediocre tier. We saw some of his potential last season, and that was why he was trying, or that was when he was trying to quit, so seeing him do well in the season, as he's mentally ready to play the game this season, was great to watch. He seemed well liked on his team, just based on certain relationships from last season, and the shots of who he's always around, like Nichelle, but none of those relationships were even or ever focused upon. In detail, at least. He was in a safe position throughout the pre-merge of the season and performed solidly enough in challenges. He did end up winning the first immunity challenge once the merge came around, though he wasn't in any danger whatsoever. Again, there was no discussion regarding his alliances and other strategic planning, so that is something that I definitely do hold against him, especially on this ranking. A part of me thinks that he benefited because he was really the single person around a bunch of duos and trios, like the Hockey Brothers and Bowie being a block, Caleb and Priya, MK and Julia, and Axel and Ripper. So there really wasn't any reason for anyone to target him, and it did bring him far. This is great positioning. Yet again, none of this was intentional on his part, so I can't give him too much credit when it comes to this. Damien did find the immunity idol, which was impressive, but it was clear that it was going to be stolen from him, which does end up happening. I think Damien is pretty good socially, can hold his own in the challenges as well. He's just really not strategic, but he does have the urge to play the game, and he wasn't an idiot. So I guess it makes sense why he got out 6th and was booted before the dumb Hockey Bros, and why he's on the solid tier, despite not doing anything revolutionary. He just got outplayed by the more active members and people making deals, which he never really did. He never really did anything great, but he's consistently solid, hence his position here. At 4th is MK. I think she's in the argument for being one of the most improved in the season. MK clearly made a pre-game alliance with Julia, which was smart and is another example of her working with people she doesn't really like, or this is an example of someone doing that, which is something many people, not only on Total Drama, but just on reality TV in general, aren't able to do. We see her continue to do this when she and Julia decide to work with Bowie so they can get away with their losing streak, or get away from their losing streak. I'm docking her a bit for this, since she had to rely on cheating for 3 episodes, where if the 3rd and 4th episodes were losses that they were acknowledged to be, there's a good chance that she's a goner, especially by the 4th episode. At the same time, Chris is aware of this and allows her to cheat, so I guess I can't complain too much. Ultimately, her cheating did get back on her, since it was exposed right as the merge started, and Chris McLean was very hard on her at the time. She was in the bottom 2 during the Bowie round, but she luckily had her ally work things out in her favor, though Bowie definitely had a poor reputation that affected him. It seemed like MK used her lay low strategy, which definitely did work this time, but she was definitely more strategic in the game, and was able to be more active, instead of being under the radar just to be a bit too passive. Ultimately, MK and Julia could only do so much before one of them was split up, and MK campaigned her butt off to stay, but this was a reverse psychology move that Julia played on her. Despite that, MK's main issue is that she still isn't really liked amongst the cast, but she isn't disliked either, which is why she was able to skip a bunch of votes, and it plays into her under the radar strategy. I do think she's one of the few who learned from last season, and utilized her skills a bit better here. Challenges are still not her strong suit, but she used herself not being good at challenges as almost a benefit. Overall, I think she made some slight tweaks around how she played on her first season, but she does have a lot of the similar flaws here. I think she was more active and aware than a lot of the others in the cast, hence her being here. And the final person in this placement and the bronze prize goes to Caleb. Obviously, he is the other person that is really the most improved in the season. Clearly, he didn't do much before his first boot on the season, or last season, so there's clearly some potential for him to be better if he were ever on another season, just based on that one episode. He was determined to not be an early boot again, so he wanted to align with the best player, which he considered to be Priya. This was a good move, but we don't see him aligned with anyone else, especially in the beginning of the season. He could have aligned with Melly, which gives him a numbers advantage of 3, but she dug her own grave, to be fair. He was in a safe position on his team, so he was never really in danger. His team wouldn't have even went to elimination if the cheating from the other team wasn't allowed. Once he entered the merge, no one was really targeting him, and it seemed like he had decent relationships with people that were on his team, so there's no incentive for them to turn on him or them to turn on one another. While he shows some elements of being strategic and kind of manipulative, his poor communication skills causes him to be in a bind where he is exposed by Z, and he only makes it due to Z being Z. He had to win the next 2 immunity challenges, or else he would have been sent home in those rounds, and relying on immunity is not a good thing in the game, since it's such a thin variable. Once he could not win another challenge, he was in a bottom two again, though it was because the Hockey Bros voted for him to go due to a coin flip. And then he won the semi-final challenge. While we did see him align with Julia during the last third of the season, he was kind of pressured into it and really was all over the place with how he tried to juggle Julia and Priya, since he's a person of his word, to an annoying degree. In the end, he wasn't really disliked, but he really wasn't liked either, as most of his team in the finale only was on his side because he was the strongest competitor to go against Julia, the person they all disliked. Caleb has all the groundwork to be a great player, some concepts of strategy, decent enough social skills that he didn't really use to his advantage, especially even compared to his first season, and good in challenges, but it doesn't come together as well as it should have. The silver prize of second and the first person in this tier is Priya. I am going back and forth about whether she should be second or first, for some of the reasons that I will get into later. Priya entered the season and she didn't have a target on her, despite being the winner of last season, which I do think is very impressive, as Boy couldn't say the same thing. She obviously got very close with Caleb, had people like Millie and Damien on her team, where she was good with everyone on her team. She tried to help Millie salvage her game, but she really had to let her go, and we didn't see any more active gameplay from her for the rest of the pre-merge, since she was just focused on Caleb and she didn't really handle Emma that well, which is why she was in the bottom two during that episode. It was made to look like she or Z would have been eliminated had Nichelle not quit in the fifth episode, though I'm leaning on Z on that one. There really wasn't a whole lot that was notable during the first part of the post-merge, since she was shockingly under the radar, since despite being in a very obvious pairing, but there are other pairings as well. Of course, she won immunity during episode 8, and people really started rallying around her when Caleb was exposed, and there was a mention that a lot of people did like her, though we didn't see a lot of her socializing with other people. Of course, her and Caleb eventually get close again, after Julia fails to keep them apart, and she ends up somewhat working with Julia, because Caleb has a deal with her, and he forced Julia to work with and protect Priya. So she had to deal with that over the last few votes. She was able to make it close to her finale run again, and she was about to make it to her second consecutive final, the finals during the Reboot seasons being the final three, but was idled out by Julia as she finally convinced Caleb to turn on the latter. Priya reminds me a lot of Zoe in the fact that they are very consistent players. Both contribute to the challenges, so there's really no need for them to be booted pre-merge, but she isn't too dominant in challenges where she comes off as threatening. Both have good social games in their seasons, but the thing with Priya is that one of her interactions are very focused on in a season, which was Millie last season and Caleb this season, which overshadows it, where we see Zoe interacting with more people on both of her seasons. I do think Priya is more strategic and aware of her game, as well as mechanisms. Consistency is a very good trait for players to have, and it shows the difference between the really good players and the fluke players. And the golden prize of first goes to Julia. Honestly, I'm not too sure about her being number one or number two, since I do think there are some issues, but I feel like she has more good or great moments compared to Priya as a player. For some reason, she didn't have a target on her entering the season, based on what she did last season, but she definitely used it to her advantage. She made a pre-game alliance with MK, which was definitely a good move, and it showed that she can move on from grudges and can work with anyone to further herself, which many people cannot do. Julia somehow avoided being one of the first two boots on her team, though Scary Girl and Chase did not help themselves, and it was clear that she would have been booted next had they lost a challenge. Not targeting the trios in one of those rounds, when it's just herself and MK against them now, wasn't smart looking back at it. Due to this, she and MK did end up cheating through the next three challenges, and I definitely do hold that against her, but they were able to convince Bowie to agree, and Chris did allow it to happen. Julia was somehow able to convince everyone that Bowie was the main cheater, though he also had a negative reputation entering the season, but at least she finally made a move against the trio, and Bowie especially. She then single-handedly won the next challenge for herself and the Hockey Bros by doing everything, and then was somehow able to weaponize Caleb to her benefit by forcing him into an alliance, which was definitely smart and gave her some cover. She toned it down while MK over-campaigned to save herself, which got MK booted, and she was able to steal the idol from Damien, and then used it for herself when she was about to get fourth again. While Julia still was not liked at all throughout the season, she was not as actively aggressive and antagonistic to others like she was in her last season, so I do see that as an improvement. She did win some immunity challenges of the last few episodes of the season, so she did rely on immunities a bit, but not nearly as much as she did last season. Of course, there's the issue of her pulling off damn near all of her villainous actions off camera, but that's mainly an issue with the writing. But it does come off as plot convenience, which is why that despite her being well-rounded, I cannot feel great putting her too high, which is something that will be shown in the eventual Game Player's tier rankings overall for the TD cast once I combine this cast with the prior 3 generations. There are still huge social holes to her game, which she does not necessarily improve much throughout the season, but tones down her more unlikable areas, which I do give her props for. So that is my Game Player tier rankings for the 2024 season of the reboot, and I'm so glad that my coverage of this season is over, as I've made it very clear that I do not like this season. Anyways, there's definitely going to be more total drama videos coming up in the pipeline, where I am going to update my overall Game Player tier rankings list, including this generation, and I am going to update my seasons rankings, including the 2 reboot seasons. I'm also planning on determining who is the best competitor out of all total drama seasons by specifically focusing only on the challenges of each episode and deciding and looking at their performance and seeing who's consistently performing well, who's consistently performing poorly, and I'll have a ranking of who's the best competitor to the worst competitor in each season based on not only their wins but their rate of performance and all of that jazz. And I'm just going to be making more total drama videos in general. So you can be on the lookout for that. Thank you all for watching. You can like the video, you can watch other videos, you can follow me on Twitter, you can follow me here by subscribing, and I'll definitely be back with something soon. Bye!